A king so wise that two women brought him an impossible problem, and he solved it in 30 seconds. A man so wealthy that silver was said to mean nothing in Jerusalem during his reign, the way gravel means nothing in a driveway. A builder whose single great project has been searched for, argued over, and mourned for nearly 3,000 years. And yet for all his brilliance, for all his gold and his glory, Solomon ended up doing the one thing he swore he would never do. And when he did, it set in motion a chain of events that would shatter his kingdom, scatter his people, and echo all the way down to us today. I am talking, of course, about Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, the man the ancient world called the wisest who ever lived. And if you think you already know this story, I want to gently suggest that you may only know the highlights reel, because the full arc of Solomon's life, from his unlikely birth to his slow, complicated unraveling, is one of the most fascinating and human stories in all of ancient history. So let us start at the very beginning, which is, in Solomon's case, a rather scandalous place to start. Solomon's mother was Bathsheba, and if you know your Bible, you know that name comes loaded. His father, King David, had seen Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop, had summoned her to the palace, and had engineered the battlefield death of her husband, Uriah the Hittite, to cover the whole affair. It is not exactly the kind of origin story that promises a blessed life. The first child born of that union died in infancy, which the biblical text frames as a consequence of David's actions. And then Bathsheba conceived again, and this second son they named Solomon, a name rooted in the Hebrew word for peace, shalom, a word that felt, given everything, almost like a prayer. Solomon was not David's oldest son. He was not even close to the front of the line for succession. David had many sons by many wives, and palace politics in Jerusalem was fierce. The years leading up to Solomon's reign were marked by ambition, betrayal, and outright violence among the king's children. His older brother Absalom launched a full rebellion against David and died for it. Another brother, Adonijah, tried to seize the throne as David lay dying. It was Bathsheba, with the help of the prophet Nathan, who intervened, going to the aged king and reminding him that he had promised the throne to Solomon. David, in one of his last acts, summoned his energy and made it official. Solomon was anointed king, while Adonijah's celebration feast was still going on down the hill. You can imagine the awkward moment when the news arrived at that party. So Solomon came to power in circumstances that were messy, contested, and fragile. And almost immediately, the ancient text gives us a story that tells us everything about who Solomon would become. Early in his reign, Solomon traveled to Gibeon, where a great altar stood, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings there. That night, God appeared to him in a dream and asked a question that most of us, if we are honest, would fumble badly. The question was simple: what do you want? Name it, and it is yours. Solomon could have asked for long life, or riches, or the destruction of his enemies. Instead, and here is the thing that every ancient commentator marveled at, he asked for wisdom. Specifically, he asked for the ability to govern his people well, to tell right from wrong, to understand the complexity of human situations. The text says, God was so pleased by this answer that he gave Solomon not only the wisdom he asked for, but also the wealth and honor he had not asked for. It is a remarkable little theological moment, and what I find genuinely interesting is how the story immediately puts that wisdom to the test. Not long after, two women came before the king in a dispute so raw it could have come from any courthouse in any era. Both women had recently given birth. One baby had died in the night. Now both women claimed the living child as their own, and there were no witnesses, no evidence, nothing but two mothers and one infant, and no way to know who was telling the truth. Solomon listened to both women. Then he called for a sword and announced that the simplest solution was to divide the child in two and give half to each woman. One woman agreed. The other collapsed into desperate, tearful surrender. No, she said, give the child to the other woman. Just let him live. Solomon gave the child to the woman who had been willing to give him up, because only a true mother would choose the child's life over her own claim. The story spread immediately across Jerusalem, and the text says that all of Israel heard the judgment and held their king in awe. His reputation was made in a single morning. From that foundation of reputation and divine favor, Solomon set about doing what his father David had dreamed of, but never been permitted to do. He built the temple. David, for all his greatness as a warrior king, had been told he was too much a man of blood to build a house for God. That work was reserved for the Son of Peace. Solomon spent years preparing, negotiating with Hiram, the king of Tyre, for the great cedar and cypress timber of Lebanon, wood that was prized across the ancient Near East for its quality and scent. He organized tens of thousands of workers into shifts, rotating laborers through the mountains and the construction site, so the labor never stopped. The project took roughly 7 years to complete, which sounds modest until you consider the scale of what he was building and the tools he was doing it with. The temple stood on a ridge in Jerusalem that is still one of the most contested pieces of real estate on the planet. Its inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, housed the Ark of the Covenant, the gold-covered chest that, according to the tradition, contained the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. The furnishings were breathtaking by any standard. Carved cherubim overlaid with gold, a great bronze basin called the sea, supported on the backs of 12 bronze oxen, lampstands of pure gold. When Solomon stood before the completed structure and offered his dedication prayer, he asked something quietly remarkable. He asked God not to limit the temple's reach to Israel alone, but to hear the prayers of any foreigner who came there in sincerity. For a king of that era, that was an unusually broad-hearted thing to ask. And the ancient text records that fire fell from heaven and filled the temple with a cloud so thick that the priests could not stand inside it. Whether you read that literally or as powerful poetry, it is one of the most arresting images in all of biblical narrative. Then came the visit that cemented Solomon's fame beyond the borders of his own kingdom. The Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's reputation and came to test him herself. The location of Sheba is debated among historians. Most point toward the Arabian Peninsula, and there is a strong Ethiopian tradition that identifies Sheba as a kingdom in the Horn of Africa. Wherever she came from, she came in force. A great caravan of camels, loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones. She arrived, met Solomon, and proceeded to ask him every hard question she had prepared. The text says, Solomon answered every single one, that nothing was too difficult for him. She toured his palace, his banquet table, his household arrangements, the way his staff was organized and clothed, the offerings he made at the temple. And then she said something that has stayed with me. She said she had heard the reports of his wisdom and had not believed them, and now she saw that the half of it had not been told to her. Think about that. She arrived skeptical, and she left saying the reality was greater than the rumor. In an age of inflated royal propaganda, that is a remarkable admission for one monarch to make about another. The gifts they exchanged were staggering. Gold, spices in quantities never seen before in Jerusalem, precious stones, and Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba everything she asked for, plus gifts from his own hand. There is a persistent tradition, especially alive in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that their meeting produced more than a diplomatic alliance. The Ethiopian text, known as the Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings, tells a detailed story of a son born from their union, a young man named Menelik, who later traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father and then returned to Ethiopia, bearing, according to that tradition, the Ark of the Covenant itself. It is a story that Ethiopia has guarded and believed for over 1,000 years. Mainstream historians treat it as legend, but it is worth noting that the Ethiopian Church claims to hold the Ark to this day, and no outside scholar has ever been permitted to examine it. File that under mysteries I cannot solve for you. Now, here is where I want to pause and invite you into the story of this channel for just a moment. If you have found your way here and you love history, especially these layered ancient mysteries that never quite resolve cleanly, I would love to have you subscribe. Scholar Eli is built for exactly the kind of viewer who is not satisfied with the surface version of any story, and there is always more to dig into. Anyway, back to Solomon, because Solomon's story now begins to curve. The same text that praised his wisdom records, with uncomfortable clarity, how the seeds of his downfall were planted at the height of his glory. Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Many of these marriages were political alliances, the ancient equivalent of a diplomatic treaty. And as he aged, his foreign wives brought their gods with them. Solomon built shrines for the deities of Moab, Ammon, Sidon, and others, places where his wives could worship. The text says plainly that Solomon himself followed after these gods in his old age, that his heart was not fully with the God of Israel, as David's heart had been. For a man who had been given the dream, who had stood in the temple he built, who had asked for wisdom above all else, this is a devastating arc. He had more information about what he was doing and what it cost than almost any person alive, and he did it anyway. There is something painfully human about that. The consequences came not with thunder, but with fracture lines. The text records that God appeared to Solomon a second time, not in the warm, open dream of Gibeon, but in a harder message. Because of what Solomon had done, the kingdom would be torn from his line, not in his lifetime, as an honor to David, but in his son's time. One tribe would remain to the house of David, the rest would go. Solomon had enemies rise against him in his later years: Hadad the Edomite, Rezon of Damascus, and significantly, a young official from within his own administration named Jeroboam, who was told by a prophet named Ahijah that he would rule 10 of the 12 tribes after Solomon. Solomon heard about it and tried to have Jeroboam killed. Jeroboam fled to Egypt and waited. Solomon died after reigning for roughly 40 years. His son Rehoboam took the throne and almost immediately made one of the most consequential decisions in the political history of Israel. The people came to him asking for relief from the heavy taxes and forced labor that Solomon's grand building projects had required. Rehoboam consulted his father's older advisors, who told him to lighten the load, and the people would serve him loyally forever. Then he consulted the young men he had grown up with, and they told him to come back harder, make the burden heavier, show them who was in charge. Rehoboam chose the young men's advice. The northern tribes walked away on the spot. Jeroboam came back from Egypt and became king of 10 tribes. The united kingdom of Israel that David had built and Solomon had inherited split in two, and it never came back together. The temple stood for centuries after Solomon, until the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it, probably in the late 6th century BCE. The Ark of the Covenant vanished from the historical record at some point around that era, and where it went is one of the great unanswered questions of religious archaeology. Ethiopia claims it. Some scholars suggest it was hidden before the Babylonian siege. Others think it was simply destroyed or carried off. No one has produced it. No verified physical trace of Solomon's temple has ever been excavated, largely because the site it stood on remains among the most politically sensitive ground in the world, where large-scale digging is impossible. The mysteries Solomon left behind are, in some ways, bigger than the man himself, and yet the fingerprints of this one king are everywhere you look in the ancient worlds downstream. 3 books of the Bible are attributed to him: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. The wisdom tradition of ancient Israel is inseparable from his name. In Islamic tradition, Suleiman is a prophet granted authority not only over humans, but over wind, animals, and the jinn. In Freemasonic ritual, the building of Solomon's temple is the central mythological drama. The Ethiopian church builds its entire claim to sacred heritage around him. Medieval Europe filled illuminated manuscripts with tales of his wisdom. He is woven into traditions across continents and millennia in a way that almost no other ancient figure is. What I keep coming back to At the end of all of it is the gap between the dream at Gibeon and the shrines he built for foreign gods in his old age. He asked for wisdom, he received it, and then, across decades of extraordinary success, he slowly did the exact things his wisdom should have told him not to do. Solomon is not a cautionary tale about stupidity or ignorance. He is something more uncomfortable than that. He is a story about how brilliance and knowledge are not the same thing as faithfulness to what you know. And 3,000 years later, that particular human problem has not gotten any simpler. If you have a theory about what really happened to the ark, or what you think Solomon's legacy truly is, whether it is the temple, the wisdom literature, the split of the kingdom, something else entirely, I would genuinely love to read it in the comments. These are the conversations I built this channel for. And if you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most extraordinary lives, the next one you might want to watch is the story of the prophet Elijah, a man who came just a generation after Solomon, who watched the kingdom fracture exactly as promised, and who ended up taken to heaven in a chariot of fire without ever dying at all. That one is waiting for you. If you are not subscribed yet, please consider joining us here at Scholar Eli. We are in the business of asking the questions that history left open, and there is never a shortage of them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.